Good evening and welcome to the fifth lecture of our 2021-22 Boston Speaker Series. I'm Jared Bowen, the Executive Arts Editor and host of Open Studio at GBH. And it is great to see you all here at Symphony Hall with us. Even though the mask wearing continues, it's nice to have some sense of normalcy as our house grows again. And for those of you watching at home, just know that there is a state-of-the-art ventilation system here at the hall. So if you haven't been back yet, come and try it for our next lecture on March 23rd with Theresa May. Mrs. May became Prime Minister after the historic Brexit referendum and was only the second woman in British history to hold the position. She'll weigh in on post-Brexit Britain and Boris. Just a few requests this evening to turn off your cell phones or silence them. Just take a moment to do that. Remain seated for the entire program. And of course, please wear your mask over your entire face throughout the program. I always feel weird saying that. I feel like I'm the second grade teacher or something. Jamie Metzl, as we introduce tonight's program, is a leading technology and healthcare futurist and author of the best-selling book, Hacking Darwin, Genetic Engineering and the Future of Humanity. In 2019, he was appointed to the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee on Human Genome Editing. He is a faculty member of Singularity University Exponential Medicine, a senior fellow of the Atlantic Council, and founder and chair of the global social movement, One Shared World. Called the original COVID-19 whistleblower, Metzl's leading role advocating for a full investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic has been picked up by virtually all major media. He previously served with the U.S. National Security Council, the State Department and Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and with the United Nations in Cambodia. He's also the author of A History of the Cambodian Genocide, the historical novel The Depths of the Sea, and the genetic sci-fi thrillers Genesis Code and Eternal Sonata. He holds a PhD from Oxford, a law degree from Harvard, and an undergraduate degree from Brown. He's also a man on the run as an avid Ironman triathlete and an ultra-marathon runner. And now, thanks to the generosity and support of GBH, please welcome Jamie Metzl.
Thanks so much, Jared, and thanks so much to all of you for being here. Doesn't it feel great to be physically together again? It's pretty amazing because we humans are biological creatures. Being together, it's not a nice to have, it's a need to have. It's baked into our evolution as a species. That's why it feels so good to be together. And that's why it's a little bit isolating for us to be isolated and at home. So I know that the hall is sold out tonight, but every seat represents somebody who is sitting at home watching. So can we give a hand and a hello to all those people? You can wave backwards at them. Yeah, I think they're that way if you want to wave. Well done. So when we look around the news today, we're barraged with all of these stories that are incredibly important. Right now, Putin and the Russian troops are potentially on the verge of invading Ukraine. We see the problems in Taiwan, across the Taiwan Strait with China. We're now hopefully toward the later half of this pandemic, and it all feels really big and important, and it is. But when we look back at this moment in the context of history, we're not going to see this as the moment of any of those things in big historical terms. We aren't even maybe going to see this as the period when the post-war era ended and whatever comes next was about to begin. But when we look back at this moment over the course of history from the big picture, what we are going to see is that this was the moment when one species among the trillions that have ever lived on this planet suddenly has the increasing ability to read, write, and hack the code of life. Life from a little less than 4 billion years ago to now got here through the realization of the Darwinian principles of random mutation and natural selection. But our one species now has the ability, and the increasing ability that will only grow with time, not just to drive our own evolutionary journey, but to drive the evolutionary journey, and it's revolutionary, of all of life on Earth. This is the era, as you've heard before, of bioengineering. Biology plus engineering. Biology isn't new, engineering isn't new, but the fact that we are engineering biology, that is what is new. And that's what's profound, and that will fundamentally transform all of our lives in many ways that we're going to discuss tonight. For millennia, we have imagined that our gods, whatever our traditions, have these incredible powers to create life, to recast life, to extend life. So what does it mean that we are now taking these powers unto ourselves? And what values will need to guide our application of these technologies to make sure that we use them to build a better, safer, more secure world, not just for us, but for all of life, versus the alternative, which is also a very, very real possibility, that we aren't able to handle these godlike powers, that we abuse them, that we don't establish the right kind of guardrails that we need to optimize the benefits and minimize the harms. And these incredible powers that have the potential to do so much good end up leading to incredible harm and the extinction of ourselves or other species. That is the issue that we're facing. And as we'll explore, I wish I could say all you need to do is just sit back and I'll tell you the story of this future, but there are all kinds of incredible world leaders, and as we speak, they've got a plan, and they're going to implement against that plan, and everything is good. As they say in Australia, Bob's your uncle. But that's not true. In fact, our leaders on the national level and on the international level don't really have a handle on how to govern all of these issues. And the challenge that we face, as we'll explore, is that these technologies are advancing exponentially. The rate of progress is mind-boggling. But our level of understanding and the governance infrastructures to make sure that we use these technologies wisely aren't keeping pace. This is a similar story for lots of revolutionary technologies, but as we'll explore, this is moving faster than really anything that's happened in terms of technology in our history. And just to give one example, a small example, a metaphor perhaps of what we're facing in a positive way, is to understand these mRNA vaccines. I used to, before this became an insanely sensitive topic, to say, who here's been vaccinated? And everybody would hopefully raise your hand. I love these vaccines, and I'm so happy for them. But now that's become sensitive, so I won't say that. But I would imagine that most, what's that? We all have to be. That's great. Everybody raise your hand, and cheers for us. We're all vaccinated. So good. And I imagine that most of you were vaccinated with the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer or the Moderna. And if that's the case, that's also great. And because we're in Boston, I will tell you something that you may already know about the history of these vaccines, particularly the Moderna vaccines. On January 11th, 2020, after 2 weeks of not sharing the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, a Chinese scientist, in contravention of the orders of the Chinese government, shared the sequence, the whole genome sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. It arrived in Boston on January 11th, 2020, 2 years ago. It took 2 days, 48 hours from receiving that file, not the virus, the file of the sequenced genome of this virus, to when the formula for the Moderna for the Moderna vaccine, the exact same vaccine that is in my body and many of your bodies, 2 days for that vaccine, the formula for that vaccine to be developed. And you may imagine from your knowledge of history, maybe some of you remember the polio vaccine and imagining or even seeing images of the Jonas Salk lab or the Sabin lab. And there was all this stuff. There were bleakers and bottles and people in white coats. We didn't have any of that in those 2 days when the Moderna mRNA vaccine was developed. What you had was people in front of laptops, because what they were doing was big data analytics. They were running computer models that were identifying what was the target, the spike protein that we'll talk about in a second, and how to target that with the mRNA vaccine. It's a whole different model of how we think about what we're doing. Some of you, I'm sure many of you, will remember from the 1950s, the polio vaccine. There was the dead virus and the weakened virus. But they were all versions of the polio virus, and that was what created the vaccine. And when those viruses were inserted into people's bodies, either through shots or through orally, then your body had the immunological response, and that's how people of the last generation developed the immunities that saved so many people's lives. But with the mRNA vaccines, the thing that's being injected is not a virus, it's a set of instructions. It's a set of instructions to your cells to do something that on their own they would not be able to do. Because the way the cell works is our genomes. If you imagine the cell as an egg yolk with in the nucleus with the egg white, which is the cytoplasm, the genome is in the egg yolk. And so the genome is giving instructions to the ribosomes, which are in the egg white. And your genome doesn't travel out of the nucleus, out of the egg yolk to do it. It has these messenger RNAs that are delivering those instructions. And what the mRNA vaccines are doing is hijacking that process by delivering a different set of instructions to the ribosomes in your egg yolk. And they're saying, here's what we want you to do. We want you to create this foreign object. And the foreign object is the spike protein, the equivalent of the spike protein on the SARS-CoV-2 virus, those little coronas that you all see in pictures of the coronavirus every day. And then when your body makes that spike protein equivalent, your body recognizes this thing that you have created, but identifies it as a foreign object and mounts an immunological response, and that's how you get your immunity. It's a different way of thinking about delivering healthcare, delivering information to your body. And so think about everything that needed to have happened to make these mRNA vaccines possible. We had to understand the machinery of the cells. We had to understand the language of the cells with sequenced genomes, the genetic information, the mRNA information. We had to figure out how to hack the cell through these alternate approaches with the mRNA messages delivered in these little balls of fat. And then we had to figure out how those exact instructions would translate into our body doing something that it had never done before that would be identified as this foreign object. This is just one small example, but it points to this much bigger issue of where we're going, again, with this technology that will allow us to read, write, and hack the code of life. Not just human life, as I said, but all of life. But to understand that, we need to take an even bigger step backward. And just to see the way that we are processing knowledge and information today as a global humanity. 100 years ago, there were about 2 billion people on Earth. And of those, about 20% of them were literate. And so that means that there were about 400 million people on this planet who had the ability to share information beyond, in most cases, beyond the small communities around them. And that's a lot, but it wasn't so much. And there were all kinds of division, and if you had something, you wanted to share it, you could send it with the mail. A little later, you could send it through the telegraph, but sharing information was extremely, extremely difficult. Now we have nearly 8 billion people. We have 85% global literacy rate. And so that means we have about 6.5 billion people around the world who are able to share, participate in the world of shareable knowledge. So these 6.5 billion people every day are waking up and solving some kinds of problems. But because we are connected to each other through these incredible networks like the internet, we don't have to ever solve problems that have already been solved. When we were all in elementary school, do you remember in social studies learning about the Bronze Age, the Copper Age, the Iron Age, these different ages that happened in different times, in different places? And some civilizations experienced one of these developmental phases sometimes thousands of years before or after the others. And so imagine if you are in one of those civilizations that doesn't have the recipe for copper or bronze or whatever. That means you have to wait however long, 100 years, 1,000 years, 2,000 years, before you can start doing all of the things that you will in the future be able to do once you have the recipes for these metals. And that's a huge redundancy. And from a collective perspective, it's kind of a huge waste because all of that brain power that went to launching the Copper Age in one civilization could have been spent on figuring out what to do with copper had they had the recipe. We don't have to solve that problem now because anything that anybody invents, pretty much immediately everybody else has. So we are unleashing this massive amount of human brain power, human creativity onto the world. And we have tools that are beyond the imagination, not just of our ancestors, but even of ourselves 3 or 4 years ago. And the reason why it feels that our technology is advancing faster, it's improving faster than it has in the past, is because it is advancing, it is improving far faster than it has in the past. And the reason is because we're seeing a superconvergence of technologies. We talk about these technological revolutions with using different names, and in many ways it's just a shorthand. We talk about the computer revolution, the AI revolution, the biology revolution. But in many ways they are all connected and increasingly connected, because we had to have the computer revolution to get to the machine learning and AI revolution. We had to have the machine learning and AI revolution to understand the complexity of biology. When I talked about these mRNA vaccines and all of the complex computations and the computer algorithms that were needed to figure out how to do what we wanted to do, all of that is way beyond the raw processing power of the human brain. It's only achievable with these tools. And as we use these tools to unlock the secrets of biology, secrets that have evolved over billions of years, we're finding new ways of just understanding how things can be organized, new models of biological design. And then those biodesigns are folding back into the modeling of computer chips. So now we have computer chips based on biological designs that are better, stronger, faster than what we've had before, that create even better tools for AI and machine learning, that unlock even greater secrets of biology. And this is just one example of this superconvergence where all of these technologies are folding together, inspiring each other. And because that makes it so that our rate of change and technological change is accelerating. And remember when you were kids and people talked about doubling your pennies every day and soon you have all the money in the world. Because we are experiencing that kind of exponential change, there's a bit of a paradox, because the way our brains work is for linear thinking. When our ancestors were living on the savannas in Africa, the best way to figure out what you were going to do tomorrow is by understanding what happened to you yesterday. If yesterday you learned that you could or couldn't eat something, that when you heard a certain noise you should or shouldn't run, that was a really great model for how to live today and tomorrow. And that's how we think. When we open up our refrigerators in the morning, we don't brace ourselves because we think what we find is going to be radically different from when we opened our refrigerator before bed. You just kind of don't even think about it because you remember what it looked like then. Open your refrigerator, and it pretty much always looks that way now. But in an era of exponential change going forward is the rate of change is faster, increasingly faster than what we've experienced in the past. And so if we don't force ourselves to think kind of like science fiction writers about what the future is going to look like, if we don't force ourselves to suspend the built-in conservatism of our brains, we're going to miss it. We aren't going to be ready for this rate of change that is going to fundamentally transform our lives. And this is coming, and it's coming quickly, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which it's coming. But before we do, there's one other thing, because when we talk about humans having these powers of the gods, we all have this natural instinct to say, wait, hold on a second, this is uncomfortable. This is uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable for many of us because it just doesn't feel natural. We have a sense of what nature is, and the idea of hacking our own biology, hacking the biology of our future children, plants and animals, and all these other things that we are going to do and are already doing now feels unnatural. But when we take a step back and kind of probe deeper into that term natural, we realize that nothing in our lives, not much of our lives, is natural. If you go to Whole Foods, it's great if you want to shop for organic fruits and vegetables, but pretty much none of the fruits and vegetables at Whole Foods would be recognizable in their current form to our ancestors 10 or 15,000 years ago. Almost none of the animals producing the meat that we would buy at Whole Foods or wherever would be roughly familiar to our ancestors from 10 or 15,000 years ago. We are living in constructed environments. And even those of us like me who love to go to Colorado and just to be in quote unquote nature, the reason we love nature is very different from how our ancestors thought about nature. I guarantee you, all of your ancestors hated hiking in the forest. And you know why? Because the forest was full of predators and they wanted to eat you because they were trying to survive and you were a pretty convenient source of calories. Our ancestors killed them. And now we can go hiking in the woods and say, oh, we love nature. So long way of saying, the things I'm about to describe to you are going to feel scary to you. And they should feel scary to you. They're going to feel unnatural to you, and they should feel unnatural to you. But my charge to you is to take a step back and let's explore these things together. And the fact that this future, I believe, is coming doesn't mean that it's preordained and predetermined. As a matter of fact, the central theme of my talk is that it's not preordained or predetermined, and that it's up to us to make sure that a values framework guides the application of these technologies. And we like to think, when we talk about this genetically engineered future, that it's going to happen one day, that someday somebody's going to ask us, or one of us, or all of us, should we genetically engineer our future, or should we not genetically engineer our future? And then maybe we'll think about it, we'll have a little vote, and we'll say, all right, we'll do it, or we won't do it. But that's not how this is going to happen. This is going to happen, like most technological revolutions, in small, logical steps, each one following the other. And when we think about the technology and biotech revolutions, most of us think about healthcare, and there's a good reason that we do that, which is because for most of us, that is the primary area right now in which we are interacting with these technologies. We're in Boston. Many of you are familiar with all of the revolution in gene therapies and other healthcare modalities that are tailored for each person's individual biology. And so right now, we're in the middle of a pretty fundamental transition from our world of generalized healthcare based on population averages. And that means when you go to CVS and you get a Tylenol, there's a small percentage of us that will die from taking a Tylenol. A regulator at somewhere has decided that collectively we're able to take that risk. In our world of generalized health, you find out if you're one of those very rare people who die from taking a Tylenol by taking a Tylenol. And with most cancer treatments, that's the way in most parts of the world. That's the way it works. We're going to start you out on this one protocol. It may help you, it may hurt you, it may do nothing. If it doesn't help you, then we're going to move you to something else. Same thing, may help you, may hurt you, may do nothing. That's generalized medicine. Precision, personalized medicine is a little bit different. And that is, we are going to identify who you are on a biological, on a molecular level to the greatest extent possible. And then any intervention that we're going to make, we're going to do our best to tailor that intervention to you. It's not an N of 7.8 billion, it's an N of 1, and you are the one. So how do we know who you are? So we need to get your personal history, your family history, your biometric and other information. But increasingly, the most important piece of information about you, the foundation of your electronic health record, will be your whole sequenced genome. And I know many of you, raise your hand if you've sent in a mouth swab to 23andMe or Ancestry or one of those companies. All right, some of you. And raise your hand. My guess is very few of you, but who've had your whole genomes sequenced, like I have. Good job. That's why you get to sit in the front row. I believe, so right now, the number of people who've had their whole genome sequenced is in the millions, but relatively quickly, we're going to move toward the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and then billions. I'm on actually the advisory board for the Personal Genomics Center at Harvard Medical School. And one of the things that we're doing is the equivalent of the Framingham Heart Study, but for sequencing newborn babies, called BabySeq. And it turns out that 3% of all newborns have some kind of potentially harmful or potentially harmful genetic abnormality. And 5% of all newborns have some genetic predisposition that increases their risk factors should they take medicines that are regularly prescribed for kids. So it's really, really useful information to have. We have to figure out what's the best way to have it, what's the best way to share it with doctors and parents, and there are a lot of the hows need to be figured out. But we're moving toward a world where all newborns will have their whole genome sequence at the same time when the heel prick blood tests are taken now to test for about 30 abnormalities. And so we're going to have much, much more information. We're all going to get more information about ourselves because in doing our analytics, whether it's for what drugs to take or what treatments may work or for cancer therapies, we're all going to increasingly rely, among other things, in contexts, on our whole genomes being sequenced. And as the data sets become ever larger of genetic or genotypic and life or phenotypic information, alongside the additional information of the other systems, because we have a systems biology. We're not just genetics and meat. We are a system of systems. We have the genome, the epigenome, the proteome, the microbiome. All of these systems are interacting with each other in the dynamic environment and interacting with the world around us. But human beings are as massively complex as we are not infinitely complex. And so we are going to understand more and more of our complex systems biology. And because the complexity of our biology has remained constant for millions of years, but the sophistication of our tools is increasing, as I was mentioning before, on this exponential J-curve. There will come a time when the sophistication of our tools meets and then exceeds the complexity of our biology. To put it another way, when we're trying to understand a single-cell organism, we feel we can understand it pretty well because of the relative simplicity of the organism and the relative complexity of our tools. As our tools get better, we'll understand complex organisms, including ourselves, even better. And as we do, and this is going to happen sooner rather than later, we're going to transition. I talked about generalized to precision healthcare. The next phase is precision to predictive. Because with this information, we're going to be able to know what our future may hold within a range of possibilities. What we call healthcare today isn't really healthcare. In most cases, it's sick care. Because you have some kind of symptom, you go to the doctor, and then your doctor tries to figure out where does the symptom come from. For many genetic disorders, that symptom may have begun from the moment of your conception, even if it took 70 years for that issue to be manifest with this symptom. So in our world of predictive health, we're going to know early on what's your range of risk factors and benefit factors. And if you know, for example, that your child has a genetic predisposition to type 2 diabetes, you'll want to make sure you instill healthy habits for eating, diet, and exercise. Or if your daughter has a genetic predisposition to a genetic form of breast cancer, you want to make sure that screenings happen earlier than they otherwise might. So this is going to be highly and increasingly actionable information. And it's going to fundamentally change not just the way that we think about healthcare, but in many ways, the way we think about ourselves. I hope that all of your parents told you what my mother told me when I was a kid. You can be anything you want to be. And I hope that you've now realized, as I have, that your mother, like my mother, was lying. There are certain things that I can be, and I hope I can be the best of those things, but there's no amount of training that I can do to win the 100-meter sprint in the Olympics. I could run 50 miles uphill to school both ways. I could eat the diet. I could do everything. I have no chance of winning. It's not within the range of my possibility. And so it's a little scary to think that we have these ranges of possibility. It's a little scary to think that in some areas they may be increasingly knowable. That doesn't mean predetermined, but increasingly knowable. And it's a little scary to think that we or others might want to make life decisions based on that information. We won't have to do it, but it will be possible. And we're going to have to figure out what to do about that. And that's why when we think about the genetics revolution, we're going to think much more broadly than just healthcare. This isn't about healthcare. This is about life. And it's about our lives, and it's about future life, because these technologies are going to transform not just the way we make babies, but the nature of the babies we make. So as all of you know, in vitro fertilization, IVF, started 43 years ago with the first IVF baby whose name was? Yes, Louise Brown in the UK. Actually, we did a big birthday party in absentia for her when she had her 40th birthday and had a IVF-style menu. I won't tell you what we served. Tapioca was for dessert. So that was a pretty revolutionary way to think about baby making, taking the eggs out of the mother, fertilizing them with the father's sperm in vitro in a laboratory, and then inserting the fertilized eggs back into the mother. A few years later, a technology called pre-implantation genetic testing was developed, which is still widely used today, mainly for high-risk parents. And with the way PGT works, is you grow these early-stage embryos for about 5 days, extract a few cells from each of them, sequence those cells, and a genome is a genome is a genome. So you have this blueprint, this recipe for future life. And then now, what that is used for is to screen out embryos that, if taken to term, would lead to kids who would have deadly genetic disorders. And so it's a way of figuring out which of the, let's call it 10 or so pre-implanted embryos to implant in the mother. But as you've all figured out, when you're sequencing the genomes of those cells extracted from the 5-day-old embryos, you don't just know whether they're going to have diseases. We don't have a disease genome, we have a human genome. So everything that is knowable, again, we are not determined by our genetics, but we are not significantly influenced by our genetics. Our genetics determine a range of possibility. And with these, let's call it 10 pre-implanted embryos, there's a difference. And whatever your criteria, if there is a more genetic trait, it's increasingly possible to evaluate ranges for the different pre-implanted embryos. As a matter of fact, I'm on the scientific advisory board for a company called Genomic Prediction that is doing exactly that for a number of genetic traits, some of which are simple traits, meaning small number of genes influence them, but some of them are complex traits, where it could be hundreds or thousands of genes, each with just a little bit to say about this kind of trait. And so you can see where this is heading. But in 2012, a Japanese scientist, incredible Japanese scientist named Shinya Yamanaka, won the Nobel Prize for his development of what are called induced pluripotent stem cells, iPS cells. And you all know what stem cells are. So iPS cells it's a process for taking an adult cell, a differentiated cell, we'll call it a skin cell. And so I'll put it in the context of reproduction, of assisted reproduction. What you can do with this is you take a skin graft from the biological mother, which has millions of cells. You can induce these cells using these Yamanaka factors back in time. So you turn these adult cells, skin cells, into stem cells. And then you move them forward in time, but in a different direction, not back into being skin cells, but you move them toward being egg precursor cells. And then say now you have, pick your number, let's call it 100,000, 10,000 egg precursor cells. And then you can move them one step forward toward move from egg precursor cells into eggs. Now you have 10,000 eggs. You fertilize these 10,000 eggs using an automated process with the father's sperm, and the average male ejaculation can have more than 1 billion sperm cells. So now you have 10,000 early stage pre-implanted embryos. Grow them all for 5 days using this automated process, extract a few cells from each, sequence those, and then you really have choice. Maybe some of you read my editorial in the New York Times on imagining going to a fertility clinic in the year 2050. But if you have 10,000 choices, you can really push things a long way. Imagine what our ancestors did. Our ancestors didn't know anything about genetics, but they took wolves and turned them into teacup poodles and chihuahuas. They domesticated all of these different crops. They took wild chickens laying 1 egg a month and turned them into domesticated chickens laying 1 egg a day. With all of the knowledge that we have, imagine how far and how quickly we are going to be able to push biology, our own biology, should we choose to do so. So this is moving very, very quickly, and the human applications are big enough. But as I said before, this is about reading, writing, and hacking the code of all of life, not just human life. And so these applications will fundamentally transform many other fields. Agriculture is a really good example. I talked about having I don't know what happened there. I talked about having 2 billion people on Earth 100 years ago and having nearly 8 billion now. What happened? We had the Green Revolution that allowed us to grow a lot more crops. And the Green Revolution was energy intensive, using chemical fertilizers, and it was used a lot of electricity and equipment. And that's why countries like China and India can have more than 1 billion people each. It's why we could have this big jump from smaller to much, much larger numbers. But our agricultural systems are unsustainable, taking huge amounts of energy. We are destroying the wild spaces that we need for the health of our planet. Our fertilizers, for example, our chemical fertilizers take 2% of all global energy use and provide and create 1.5% of all greenhouse gas emissions. So we can, as we move toward 10 billion people by 2050, if we just continue to scale what we're doing the way we're doing it, our planet is going to become unlivable. And that's why these technologies provide a different way of seeing things, of making plants that have greater yields, of thinking differently about fertilizers, and ultimately eliminating a large percentage of the chemical fertilizers that we need by engineering and manipulating the microbiomes of the roots of the plants and the soils around them. And you all get, and we all understand why crop rotation works. It's because of our staple crops like rice, corn, and wheat. They are depleting the soil, and the crops like legumes have a natural way of fixing nitrogen into the soil. So what happens if our rice and corn and wheat can function a little bit more like the legume? What if the signaling between the root and the soil microbes is such that we can have natural fertilizers without all of the negative consequences, without the algae blooms in the Gulf of Mexico and all of the harms that are created by the wonderful new technology of our fertilizers? That will be possible. Animal agriculture, in all of its forms, is responsible for about 15% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And so just from a climate perspective, we should be worried. But 70% of the animals we eat are the product of industrial animal agriculture. I see you and I have the same view of industrial animal agriculture. It's horrible. Maybe some of you saw the video essay in the New York Times this week of a chicken farm, but it breaks your heart to see these chickens. The average size of a chicken has grown 400% since 1950 because of not genetics, but just this breeding. It's grown so much that their legs can hardly hold their bodies up. All of these animals are pumped full of antibiotics, both to spur their growth and because the conditions are so horrible that if they didn't have those antibiotics, so many of them would get diseases. And that is creating antibiotic resistance that is extremely dangerous to human health. We're cutting down our forests because we need more and more land. And so it's not just the land where the animals are raised, it's the land to raise the crops to feed the animals. And so if you eat 1 calorie of a plant, it's 1 calorie. If you eat 1 calorie of beef, you had to have 30 calories of plants feeding the cow to get that 1 calorie of beef. For chickens, it's about 9 to 1. And when we think about these animals, I hope you love animals as I do, but we don't love these animals. We're not seeing these animals as whatever you may or may not believe in, somebody's creatures deserving love and respect and dignity. We see them as a means to an alternate end. So if you believe animals have souls, well then, like that soul is a waste of energy because all we care about collectively is just getting the byproduct of meat or milk from that animal. Everything else that animal does, loving its offspring or singing or whatever, because of the way we're seeing these animals, is like a waste of resource on top of the cruelty that we're inflicting, on top of the antibiotic resistance, on top of the climate change. And so there's a better way. And I certainly believe that these technologies will help move us in that direction. And in the not distant future, when we go to our local Whole Foods, I believe we will have 3 options, and hope we will have 3 options. One is sustainably raised animals, not industrial animal farms, but a premium product of sustainably raised animals. 2, plant-based meats, like the Impossible Burger, using the tools of synthetic biology. The reason why the Impossible Burger tastes like an Impossible Burger is the genetic engineering, the synthetic biology that gives it the kind of texture, gives it the kind of feel that's familiar to us. In our hands, we've eaten meat for a very, very long time. It would be great if everybody was a vegan, but not everyone's going to be a vegan. People are going to eat meat, but when we eat meat, sustainable meat, plant-based meat. But the third kind of meat, which is kind of my favorite, is cell-cultured meat. And so with cell-cultured meat, what you do is we extract stem cells from a cow, a living cow. As a matter of fact, you're best off getting the healthiest cow you can find. And you grow those cells with growing agents in a bioreactor. And then you can create meat in the bioreactor of a bioreactor, not the bioreactor of a cow. Again, if we are already seeing industrial animals as bioreactors. It's all by our actions. That's all we care about for these animals. So why not grow meat just in a bioreactor? The world's first cell-cultivated burger patty was created in 2013 at a cost of around $375,000. It's a lot. Now, one patty of cell-cultured meat costs $10. And so we're moving toward parity. Again, I talked about exponential change. We're moving toward parity. We have massive subsidies in our industrial animal farming, and so that makes getting to this parity a little harder. But we're going to get there. And we're going to get there, and we're going to be able to grow our meats that are biologically exactly the same as animal meat from animals that we've abused and killed, but it just comes from this meat that's grown in a bioreactor, and it's healthier because we don't have all the E. coli and all those other problems that we have. It's cleaner, it's safer. We can add additional things. Let's say we wanted to replace some of the animal fats with omega-3 fats, other kinds of fats, vegetable fats. Again, it's biology plus engineering. We are the engineers, for good or for ill. And so that's why we have to think, well, how do we want to use these powers? And if you were to go, I talked about going to the supermarket, but if you were to go into any store and just twirl around in a circle and point at something, the thing that whatever you're pointing at is made from can and will be disrupted. And whether it's the threads, nylons, plastic, woods, we have a model where the raw materials that we use in our economies are cut down in many cases or dug up. That extractive model just cannot sustain 10 billion humans on Earth. And not just 10 billions, but happily, people are getting richer all across the world. And as they get richer, they want to live more like we live. This planet cannot sustain 10 billion people living like us. But that doesn't mean we should go back to the Stone Age. It means we should think differently about how we produce the materials that we need. So the tools of synthetic biology, of precision fermentation, are allowing us to grow all of these things: plastic, wood, fabric. McKinsey, the consulting firm, estimates that 60% of all physical inputs in the entire global economy could be displaced by those same materials which come from using the tools of synthetic biology. So a massive, massive transformation. It has the potential to be extremely helpful, but also disruptive, certainly in the transition. Another area, and I could go on and on about the application, but I'll just do one more, and that's data storage. DNA, as you all know, is just one little single cell. Is so much more complex than the best microchip around. I mean, just imagine the one cell, your mother's fertilized egg, had the blueprint for you. It's unbelievable. And not just that. it lasts. Recently, a couple of years ago, a DNA sample was dug up from a woolly mammoth that had died 1 million years ago. As a matter of fact, George Church, just across the river, was part of this. And it's readable, 1 million years old. There's no silicon chip right now that will be readable 1 million years from now. So there's Microsoft and Swiss Biosciences and others are now working together on a plan that is beginning to be realized for DNA data storage. As a matter of fact, all of the data in the entire world that exists now could be stored in a box the size of a shoebox. I mean, that's how great DNA is. So we're going to be able to think differently about data storage, computing, using these incredible new tools, and understanding how genetics work. Again, reading, writing, and hacking as these godlike superpowers. So all of this is just an incredible, almost overwhelming future with a real upside, but it also has real dangers. I won't quote. I used to say it was Spider-Man, but I think it was Spider-Man's uncle has the quote about power and responsibility. But these godlike powers are arriving in the context of us, with all of our great things and all of our bad things. We have significant differences between us in how we think about these kinds of technologies. When I'm as Jared mentioned, I'm a member of the WHO Expert Committee on Human Genome Editing. And in our first meeting in Geneva, we went around the room and people were saying, well, who are we representing? Who are the kinds of groups who we need to keep in mind when we're trying to make a plan for how the tools of human genome editing could be governed? And then people said, we have the community of people who are suffering from certain genetic diseases and disorders, and we have religious people and people who are worried about these technologies. And it came to me, and I said, well, we also need to think about the transhumanists. And maybe you don't know who the transhumanists are, but it's a kind of small community of people who feel that the human, Homo sapien 1.0, is kind of buggy. And so we should work toward a Homo sapien 2.0 as quickly as possible and use the tools of technology for doing that. And the point is, there's just a big range between people, from some people saying this is really scary, we're quote unquote playing God, we should never do it. And I understand that, and whether it's the GMO activists or religious activists or others, and the people who say, to hell with this Homo sapiens 1.0, let's get to 2.0 as quickly as possible. And those differences exist between societies. There are some societies that are much more comfortable with the application of technology to changing all sorts of things. And then there are other societies, many of them from the Judeo-Christian model, who have this sense of God as this watchmaker. And so if there's a plan to create Earth, then the things that you do that change that plan are inherently threatening. And on top of that, we live in a world of incredible competition, both within societies and between them. So you can imagine, we know how far parents will go to try to give their children an upper hand. We see it through the SAT prep. We see it through the people paying off the admissions counselors with all these scandals. We see it in, I spend a lot of time in Asia, in places like Korea and Japan, where acing the competitive national tests is seen as the key to everything. And there's really no limit to what parents will do, how many tutors they'll have come to their homes. These cram schools in Korea, they had to have a law that the cram schools had to close by 10 p.m. because people were having their 7- and 8-year-old kids work until midnight every night to prepare for their college entrance exams a decade later. And when I talk to friends of mine, I have one friend in Korea, and I was talking about what I mentioned to you about the possibility of embryo selection and the possibility of rank ordering embryos, your own pre-implanted embryos, from likely highest range of genetic component of IQ to the lowest among your own embryos. And I said, well, would you make that would you make a choice to implant the one that had the highest likelihood of having the highest genetic component of IQ? He looked at me like I was a lunatic. Not the way you're looking at me, because when I speak to people here, it's like, who would do that? I mean, it's like child abuse from the perspective of here. But from his perspective, who wouldn't do that? And I said, well, what would your friends and the other people who are in your community? And he said, and I mean, this is just what he said, that most people would do it, because think of how far people are willing to go to give their kids an advantage. If people felt they were taking a huge risk, obviously, nobody would do it. But we're going to get to a point where the risk ratio calculus is going to shift for people. Well, people think, well, maybe I can get a big gift, a big increased opportunity, and maybe the risk feels manageable. Maybe it is manageable, maybe it just feels manageable, but people are going to be making those kinds of choices. And we see a lot of this competition between countries that is driving these technologies. When my book, the hardback edition of my book, Hacking Darwin, was in production in November 2018, I called my publisher and I said, I have bad news and I have good news. The bad news is that this highly unethical Chinese scientist, He Jiankui, just announced in Hong Kong that he was responsible for the birth of the world's first 2 and later 3 CRISPR babies. And because my book is about this genetically engineered future, it can't come out after this life-changing, world-changing event and not mention it. That's the bad news. The good news is that in the book, I said it's going to happen, and it's going to happen in China, and here are all the reasons why it's going to happen in China. And all we need to do for the hardback, and I added more in the paperback, is just add a paragraph saying, and in late November 2018, it was announced it had already happened. So why did I know that it was going to happen? Because there was this whole pressure, and is this whole pressure in China to leapfrog the rest of the world in key technological areas, and genetics and biotechnology are one of them. And that was why in early 2020, when I was taking a hard look at how the pandemic may have started, I was a little suspicious, because it was clear by late January 2020 that more than a third of the earliest known cases of COVID-19 were of people who had no exposure to the Huanan seafood market, even though the Chinese government was saying it came from the market. And it was clear to me that, well, what did they have in Wuhan? They didn't have horseshoe bats. They didn't have bats or pangolins in this market. I'd just been in Wuhan before then. I knew Wuhan wasn't some backwater where a bunch of yokels were eating bats and pangolins for dinner every night, but a really sophisticated city, kind of China's Chicago, of wealthy, highly educated, sophisticated people. But what they did have is China's first and largest level 4 virology institute with the world's largest collection of bat coronaviruses that was doing aggressive research designed to make those scary viruses scarier, including, as we later learned, in at least applying for grants to insert specific receptor binding domains, spikes, designed to attach to human genomes at the ACE2 receptor, which is exactly what the SARS-CoV-2 virus does. So it seemed to me this could be, and I've as Jared was mentioning, I've been kind of at the forefront of raising the possibility of a lab origin and pushing for a full investigation. But if it's true, this could be this same kind of story of China wanting to leapfrog the rest of the world, not in creating any kind of bioweapon, but of leading the world in developing vaccines, a pan-coronavirus vaccine that would be very helpful, not just for China, but for us. And I think it's, in my view, and others have different views, but quite likely that that's how this accident may have started. The point is, all of these technologies exist within the context of us. They exist within the context of our complex societies, and they exist in the context of our best, and they exist in the context of our worst. And that's the real point, because it's relatively easy to imagine the dangers that we face. What we are talking about are incredibly complex systems about which we understand relatively little. We understand a lot more than we used to understand, and that's great. But when you compare our knowledge to the full complexity of biology and life, our knowledge is very, very small. And yet we are a hubristic species. We've never waited for full understanding of anything to take any steps. So we have these tools, and we are going to use them. But the question is, how can we use them as wisely as possible? Diversity. When we talk about diversity, we tend to think of having schools and workplaces that look kind of like our societies, and it's true. And those things are great. But from an evolutionary perspective, diversity, or random mutation in Darwinian terms, is the sole survival strategy of our species or any species. If we didn't have diversity, you could say we'd still be single-cell organisms, but we wouldn't even be that because those single-cell organisms would have died. Because there's no good and bad in evolution. There's just particularly well-suited to a given environment. When that environment changes, you could have been the best suited for the old environment, but you could be the worst suited for the new environment, like the dinosaurs before and after the asteroid hit. It was great to be a dinosaur before, it was better to be a cockroach after. So we don't know what the future is going to need, and our diversity is the insurance plan for our species. And if we start making decisions based on anything, including the best of intentions to eliminate deadly diseases. I mean, there are some diseases like sickle cell disease. If you're a recessive carrier of the mutation, you have increased resistance to malaria. There could be all sorts of things, and there are all sorts of things hidden in our genomes that aren't maybe even that important now, but could be important, could be essential in some future environment that we don't yet know and can't yet know. So we really have to think about diversity at the foundation of what we're doing, because if we gallop toward restricting that diversity, it could really threaten the resilience over time of our species and of life itself. And then equity. These technologies have the potential to really divide societies. My father and grandparents came to the United States as refugees after the war, and so I know what it means to be on the wrong side of somebody else's eugenic story. And we all have our stories of what's good and bad, including with regard to disease states, including deadly diseases. But who are we to make these kinds of decisions? Whenever I give talks like this, very often people come up to me afterwards and talk about having children with, for example, Down syndrome, which is most often what people discuss. And they all say the same thing, and I agree. My child has Downs. My child is the light of my life. I can't imagine in any other life, nor would I even want it. And I think that's right. But the question that we're going to be facing, and we're frankly on this issue we're already facing, is when we have 10 pre-implanted embryos and we have to pick one for implantation in the mother, what is the criteria that we will use to make that choice? There are no easy answers to this, but we have to recognize the complexity of the question. We have to recognize that even the seemingly simple questions aren't simple. And we have to recognize that we need values frameworks to guide our decisions individually and collectively. But we also need to recognize, as I've mentioned, that these technologies have the potential to unlock incredible new futures, to help us live healthier, longer lives. And we think of healthier, longer lives. Just imagine, if everybody in this room, if you could live healthy for 10 years longer than you otherwise would, imagine all the love, the innovations, the hugs, the poetry, all those kinds of things. I want that. I want that for the people I love, and I think it's great. I think it's okay to want that. We talked about climate. Nobody said we had to have 10 billion humans on Earth, but if we're going to have 10 billion humans on Earth and meet their needs, we can't just do it by scaling the things that we're doing now. We're going to have to think differently about using both our creativity and our technology. And even though that may not seem natural, we have to remember, as I said before, our world that we live in is not natural. Agriculture is a revolutionary biotechnology. It's not nature. Agriculture is a revolutionary biotechnology that has fundamentally transformed nature. So we need to really open our minds to those possibilities. And it's not just living on Earth. The reason why we have to wear scuba gear when we go diving or have oxygen when we're on airplanes is because our species, we are optimized to live on the surface of this one planet. We know our planet is going away. So if we're going to live in space and we are going to have to become a spacefaring species, we can't do it in the long term with the biology that we have. We're going to have to start making some changes to make that livable. And if we're going to need to do it at some point, now is the time. We need to start learning how to do it. And the same is true with climate change. And our planet may become livable in different ways, and we have to start working toward that. But that's why, again, this is not a conversation about science. This is a conversation about values. Science brings us to the question. Science brings us to the essential point, which is values. And as I said before, I wish I could say, I hope this has been an entertaining talk. I know the guys at the international blibbity-blubbity, they're all working on it. They have a plan. Everything's going to turn out great. Just trust them. But I'm talking with a lot of the people in the United Nations and the WHO. Nobody has a plan. Nobody knows what to do. And this often happens with new technologies, because the change is happening, and if people feel, well, if you over-regulate early, you kill the technology. But if you don't have frameworks and guidelines, and the technology just develops on its own based on whatever the criteria, and whether it's the profit motives of companies or the desires of states or other things, there's a real danger you wind up in some future that doesn't feel right. And then it's really hard to shift those path dependencies. So better to start now, not with a fully articulated plan, but at least with working toward developing some kind of consensus principles about how these technologies can develop for the common good. And so there are pieces of this on an international level. There's work that's being done with the WHO and with the United Nations and elsewhere. But it's not just that it's not enough. It's not even close to being enough. So then there's the national level. And there are some countries like the United Kingdom that have pretty good regulatory infrastructures for things like this. There are some countries like the United States that are so-so. And there are some countries that essentially have nothing. And there's a real danger that we'll have, for example, for gene therapies and for assisted reproduction, that will have the same kind of environment that we now have, dangerous environment for these questionable stem cell therapies, where people go to the Caribbean or Central Asia to get really dangerous treatments that most likely don't do anything, but because they're playing regulatory triage, finding these black holes. And so because we don't want that, one of the things that I and we are pushing for is at least every country should have its own governance superstructure that is informed both by international best practices and the unique traditions and customs of that country. But the base of this pyramid, and I think for now the most important piece of this, is all of you. That what we're talking about is how we can guide these incredibly powerful technologies where the national and international governance systems don't exist. And the way that we're going to do it is by all of us feeling a responsibility to play our own role. And so what does that mean? First, it's educating ourselves. The reason why I wrote the book Hacking Darwin, but there are lots of great books, and I really hope that you'll all commit yourselves to your own learning journey about these tools of the genetics and biotechnology revolutions. Because again, as I said at the start, this will, I'm very confident, be the story of our generation. So to understand where we are and where we're heading and what are the choices. And when you feel ready, then to engage the people around you in your communities, whether your family, your faith communities, your workplaces, elsewhere, to talk about these issues. In Hacking Darwin, I have a reader's guide for exactly this purpose. And then with your community, when you start to develop some sense of, well, what are principles that you think are important, to begin to reach out to your elected officials. Hacking Darwin, I also have a political guide. And it's not that we are going to say, we need you to do X, Y, or Z, but we need to start having conversations. We need to put these issues on the radars of ourselves, our communities, and our elected officials. Because we know these issues are coming. We know these technologies are unfolding, and they're going to be touching all of our lives. And if we want to be part of the process of ensuring that our most cherished values guide the application of our most powerful technologies, now is the time to make that happen. So it's up to you. Thank you.
You know, I was on the fence about tapioca pudding, and then you just...
Yeah, and deviled eggs.
From your perspective, what is or are the biggest threats for the use of genetic engineering science to treat and perhaps even cure many devastating diseases?
What are the threats of it?
What are the biggest threats? Yeah.
Well, so it's great. I mean, as I said before, we're going to be moving into just thinking differently about how to treat lots of diseases. The mRNA platform for the vaccines isn't just about vaccines. It's about delivering information and instructions to your body. And so the next phase of this will be about treating cancers differently. There's a lot of research about using these platforms to treat even dementia and Alzheimer's. And so there's tremendous opportunities, and we're going to see a shift, and it's going to reduce some of the disease burden, or at least open up new possibilities for treating lots of diseases, some of which are undertreatable and some which are untreatable now. But I also do a lot of work in the field of extending healthy human lifespan. And so as we extend our lifespans, which we're already seeing, we're going to open up possibilities for when we're living longer, our bodies are going to be acting up. So this is going to be an ongoing process where we really have to invest in these healthier, longer lives and use these new platforms and recognize that there's a hype cycle for all of these. And this is the second wave of the gene therapy hype cycle. The first one came crashing down after a child died at the University of Pennsylvania a couple of decades ago. But I do think that we're moving toward a new framework, and I think it's going to be very exciting.
You just mentioned cancer, and this is our next question. What advances in battling cancer will emerge from the evolution of genetic engineering?
So we're already seeing this next phase. I'll answer this one quickly with these CAR T therapies, and Boston is really the epicenter of the world. But it's essentially taking your cancer-fighting cells out of your body, revving them up with superpowers through genome editing, putting them back into your bodies and letting them just do a better job of what your body is already geared to do. And there are people beyond cancer. There are people in like David Sinclair, also at Harvard, working on aging, who are trying to say, well, as we get older, our cells are copying each other, but we have more and more errors. Our ability to fix errors is better when we're younger and worse when we get older. So what would happen if we had our error correction capabilities when we were older that were equivalent to what we had when we were younger? And again, it's understanding the code of life, understanding the mechanisms that are driving these kinds of diseases and harmful abnormalities, opens the door to new ways of addressing them.
You know, we are an instant gratification society. I won't ask for a general timeline, but which of the things that you just mentioned, cancer, dementia, Alzheimer's, do you think is most imminent in terms of treatment?
I think cancer, and I think it's great. But as connected to what I was saying before, we're seeing a lot of progress in cancer, particularly cancers in areas that are more easily reachable. That's why some of these gene therapy interventions, they're being applied for things in the blood and the eyes first, just because you can get the treatments where they need to go. But the big things that those of us, at least in most of our age ranges, are worried about, cancer, dementia, heart disease, are correlated with aging. And so if we get rid of any one of them, eliminate all of cancer in the United States, average life expectancy only increases by 3 years, because if one of these terrible things doesn't get you, something else will. And that's why it's my belief that we should shift some of this money from investing in treating the manifestations of age to treating biological age itself.
To shift to the coronavirus for a moment, we've seen the investigation into the origin of COVID-19 obstructed in China. Is it realistic to expect that investigation will be carried out to a legitimate end?
So there's no possible way the Chinese government will allow a full investigation into pandemic origins. They've done everything within their powers to prevent it, including destroying samples and hiding records. They have 7 people in prison. One incredibly brave young woman is near death for just asking questions about pandemic origins. We still need to have the fullest possible investigation. And with this group that I am one of the leaders of, we're about 24 experts around the world that have been working since 2020 in our open letters, laying out not just a plan, but a treasure map of where to look and how to look, have been in most major newspapers across the world. And so it would be great if we could have an investigation with China on board. We need to have a full investigation, not just into origins, but to origins and all of our other shortcomings and failures across the board, because for all we know, there's an even worse pandemic just around the corner. And if we can't learn the lessons of what went wrong here and apply them to building that safer world, we could have billions of deaths. This could be the warm-up pandemic. So I'm really concerned, and that's why I'm pushing so hard. And I always feel badly because I can't probably go to China anymore. I've been going back and forth for most of my adult life, and I've been personally condemned by from the podium of the foreign ministry by name. But the reason I feel like we have to keep pushing, not just on China, but everywhere, is we've got to get to the bottom of this. After the first SARS, there was a sense, well, the world's in danger, we need to do something about it. So there were all of these meetings, and just like happened in climate change. In climate change in the beginning, in Rio in 1992, it was, how do we solve the problem? By the Paris meeting on climate change, people had agreed, well, we probably can't solve the problem, but why don't we just have a meeting and every country can say, well, here's what we can do, and we'll add up the what we can do's, and that's the best that's possible. And it never adds up to solving climate change. The question is, can we solve it or not? And after SARS 1, the question was, can we do what's necessary so we don't have this exact same scenario, which is exactly what happened. You have something that happens in China, the Chinese government blocks and obfuscates, and that allows this thing to grow. It didn't work then, and so we had the same kind of Paris model. Well, let's just do the best that we can do, and that was the international health regulations, which were highly imperfect and then not even followed this time. So it's my view that this entire pandemic is fully avoidable. There's no reason this had to happen at all. But if we don't do what we need to do now, we will be back. We're entering, as I was mentioning, the era of synthetic biology, where it's easy to imagine how a small number of people could engineer viruses much more devastating than what we're facing.
You pretty much just answered the next question, which was about how severe a pandemic would be, that we could be impacted by another severe pandemic. Is there a future, going back to genome editing, how soon should we expect to see products and services on genetic engineering in the market so that an average common man can seek advantage to improve their life?
Oh, I mean, now. So yeah, I mean, I talked about some of these different products already. Genetic engineered tomatoes are being sold in Japan. We have genetically engineered salmon, which have been approved for sale here. I mean, this is already happening. That doesn't mean, that's what I was saying in the beginning of my remarks. We're never going to have the yes or no question. There are going to be a bunch of relatively small and seemingly very logical next steps. And they're going to happen more and more quickly, and that's going to be the revolution. We already have people in Boston, not far from here, who are being treated with these CAR T therapies. We have people who are being, it seems, cured of sickle cell disease, even as adults. So we're already there. This revolution is already here. It's just distributing.
This is turning this on you.
Yeah.
If you could and believed it would be beneficial, would you genetically alter your future children when they were pre-planted embryos?
It's a hard one. When I asked my mother, when she hears me talk about these things, again, I hope your mother says this, she says, "I wouldn't change a thing, you're perfect." My girlfriend always complains. It's like, that's why you're the way you are. But you know, as parents or prospective parents, what is it that we want for our kids? Health. We want them to live long and healthy lives. We want them to be resistant to disease. So none of us wants to do a science experiment on our future children. But if we knew that making a small number of genetic alterations could be the difference between living a shorter life or a longer healthy life, or having increased risk for certain ailments, or a lesser risk for certain ailments, and we believed, rightly or wrongly, that the downside cost wouldn't be huge, would we do it? And I think I probably would, because I don't really have a faith that nature is looking out for me. Nature is war, and all of the species are at war with each other, and nature isn't saying the natural thing are all the good things and the bad things. When we talk about random mutation and how it's not just a positive story, because every generation of every species, you have some things that are well suited and not suited. So these kids who are born with these deadly genetic disorders, that's diversity, that's the random mutation. The reason we have healthcare is we don't want to be part of that. We don't want to be part of the cruelty of nature. We want to get ahead of that. So I actually think it would depend. It's not like I would want, to create some kind of X-man or X-woman, but if I genuinely believed that I could deliver greater health or longevity or well-being, I think I would be very open-minded to doing it.
So I know you talked around a lot of this following question, but this asks it straight on. Is there a future where there is a distinct social class of gene-edited elites versus regular or quote-unquote defective people?
Yeah. I mean, so maybe some of you have seen the movie Gattaca or read the H.G. Wells stories about the Eloi and the Morlocks. I mean, it's easy to imagine that kind of future. And it's easy to imagine it if there is some kind of real genetic bifurcation. And I talked about living in space, but future generations of humans will live their entire lives in space. And depending on how far they are from us, they may come home and go back and forth, or they may just live there forever in these different environments with different evolutionary pressures. So you could see something like that happen. You could see something where there wasn't, like in the case of Nazi Germany, where there wasn't a real genetic difference, but there was a feeling that there was a real genetic difference. And that feeling was as real to people as anything else. And so this is something that we need to be worried about. And as I said, we should think about equity issues in all of the decisions that we make today. But if we're worried that in some future state we're going to have genetic inequality, in addition to worrying about that future state, we also need to look at ourselves today. Because what are those genetic differences? How might they manifest? Well, you might say, well, some people will be predisposed to have better functioning brains. Right now, the average kid born in the Central African Republic in the context of their civil war and mass malnutrition, their brains don't function as well as our kids' brains do. It's not genetic, it's malnutrition. If we're okay with living in this kind of world today, we can't just imagine, we're really worried about that abstract future that may or may not arrive. So if we want to have those values because we're afraid of this dangerous future, let's have those values today and apply them so that when we get there and all along the way, we'll know who we are.
All right, well, to ease the knots in our stomachs, we always end with a fun question. How many Boston marathons have you run? Or should I ask, how many have you run today?
Thank you. No. So I've lost count, but I've done, I think, 35 marathons, 20 ultra marathons, and 13 Ironmans. But of all of the races that I do, Boston Marathon is the best. I think if I had to guess, I've probably done 15. And the reason why Boston Marathon is the best is the fans. I hope everybody in this room has cheered. But Boston fans care more about the marathon and the marathoners than any other fans in the entire world. So if you've ever cheered, thank you for cheering, and thank you for being here today. It's really been a great pleasure to spend this time with you.